University of New York. So I had like a direct appointment, did a lot of biophysics, machine learning kind of stuff. Had an existential crisis at the 2-year mark when I was like, I need to apply for faculty jobs, but do I want to be a faculty member? I don't know. So then I extended out to my network to find out what other people were doing. I found out about this thing called science policy, and then decided to switch into that. And so I got a 1-year fellowship to work in Washington, DC, in the Senate as a scientific advisor. Did that for a year, and now I'm working as a data scientist at a think tank in DC. The Center for Security and Emerging Technology is based at Georgetown University. I'm happy to talk about any and all aspects of it.
And I'm Cam Adams. I currently work for the Nature Conservancy doing climate policy in DC. So we're the world's largest environmental nonprofit, 5,000 employees worldwide. But my background's in climate science as an undergrad. I studied Earth and Oceanographic science and then took some time off. I was planning to do a PhD, but wanted a little bit of a break and went and worked in state government up in Maine for about 4 years doing scientific research jobs, but with like a clear policy management sort of nexus, which was really cool for me and led me to a slightly more interdisciplinary master's degree down at Duke, where I was doing primarily scientific research, but then also got a chance to do some more work and sort of coursework in policy and law and some other topics as I was transitioning into more of a policy focused career path, and ended up doing a very similar path. Went for a fellowship through NOAA, the Knauss Fellowship, that brought me to DC, and did a year in the Senate working for Senator Coons from Delaware on climate adaptation policy, which is my sort of focus. And I've since moved to TNC, and I focus pretty much entirely on wildfire resilience now. So my background's all marine coastal work, but I sort of did a pivot. So I've been there about a year.
Cool, great. So I think we'll start with sort of a more broad question that was submitted to us by Ricky Oliver, who's a 6-year PhD in applied physics. So he asked, to what extent can science policy mean being a scientist? I think that's a big question for folks who are coming from this academic, very research intensive background. How much of your current role is sort of like science? I know that you're doing data analysis, so maybe this is like more one-to-one, but I'm curious about both of your answers.
Yeah, I can start. So my current role is very policy focused. It's sort of policy in the most pure sense, to do a lot of work with Congress. Like we'll see bills come out and they want to, get help making them better, improve the policy. We're always tracking sort of what the federal agencies are doing in the work and trying to support implementation of all the work that they're doing. So I have almost no direct connection to science on a day-to-day basis, in the sense that I'm not doing any primary research, any primary scientific research, which is a little bit sad. But TNC, and I think a lot of organizations like us, really like to pull scientists into policy roles, because it's our job to make sure that policy is connected to the science. And so we do, as an organization, we have chapters in all 50 states. So we do a lot of research kind of within communities, within natural systems that connects to our policy. And one of my primary roles is to sort of, connect those dots and put it together. And so I think they try to pull scientists because they really want people who know how to manipulate and understand that science, such that we can use it to inform better policies. So that's my kind of closest connection. I do a ton of research and writing and lots of skills I learned through science, but I'm not, in the lab, in the field, doing it in that way. Yeah.
And then also just gonna jump on that for a second, because I know the TNC also does have like more science focused roles as well, which I think I am very new to learning about all of this, but it was really cool to hear that NGOs sometimes, I don't know about oftentimes, do also have those roles that are more science focused.
That's right. I think TNCs are, if you're in the environmental space, especially, a really good example of that, because we aren't just a DC office of policy people. We have that, that's where I sit, but the vast majority of our US staff are in these chapters, and we have, huge amounts of land throughout the country. And so we have preserve offices and staff that live in particular places, and it's their job to manage and understand the natural environment. So I'm sure our scientific staff outnumber our policy staff. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So I like the question, and I just want to emphasize that there's kind of two angles that you can see, like being a scientist doing policy. There is what is like this technical sciencey thing that you're doing to help advance policy, and then there is like looking at federal policy and seeing how that impacts the culture of science and like how scientists can actually get their work done. And I feel like I've done a little bit of both. Obviously, like you pointed out, me being a data scientist, like I know how to program and I am unafraid of numbers and I know how math works. This is valuable to actually have when you're actually working in a lot of these policy spaces, because you're coming with folks who have very different backgrounds from you. They're still very smart, very capable, very good at what they're doing, but you can bring that kind of technical piece to the conversation and to the room that can be very beneficial for something that I do now, data scientists, where I'll sit down and crunch the numbers, do a lot of like natural language processing, a lot of modeling to like churn out the kind of results that are interesting and then translate that for the folks that I work with. So we're actually like create a policy brief and like go to Congress and like talk to people about it using the language that they'll understand. And yeah, with these two different kinds of angles where it's like you can bring that way of thinking and that approach to data to a policy conversation to kind of help motivate it. And then also everyone here cares about like development and technological advancements and security and all of these kinds of things that involve funding science and being a scientist in the room who can understand how like you get more of that sort of visceral feeling for how is this policy actually going to impact the person who's doing the science, like that perspective can also be really beneficial.
That's awesome. Okay, so then thinking back to when you sort of like first started getting into the science policy world, I think you've both given us a good sense of like what are some marketable skills we've gained in these PhD programs. You talked about, you know, data analytics, working with numbers, being comfortable with math, also, you know, technical writing, non-technical writing, communicating these things. But what were sort of, I guess, areas or skills where you had to work at a steeper learning curve, sort of get up to speed? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah. Well, I guess like with anything where you're jumping into a new area, you learn the jargon and you learn the culture. Academia has a particular culture and a way of doing about it. Like you can walk into a department and you kind of know your way around and can navigate that space. Coming in from academia to working on the Hill, where suddenly I need to like wear a suit and there's a way of expressing things and there's the kind of jargon you need to use, like that kind of stuff was a little bit of a learning curve. And a lot of the development for that is, we call them soft skills, but they're so valuable. Like, I mean, they're technical and non-technical, but like they're soft managerial interpersonal communication, whatever you want to call it. But like, those still take time to develop, and being able to do that in different spaces where it's like, you can walk into a room dealing from people from all kinds of different backgrounds, all over the country, international, what have you, and like being able to sort of jump into that, I think was, yeah, something I really needed to learn how to do properly.
Yeah, and we both took the plunge going right to the Hill. I think that's kind of the ultimate example of, it's such a world in and of itself. And like you're saying, like there's the way of talking and way of doing things that felt so foreign to me coming from science. It just had a lot of imposter syndrome about it. Like how could I do that job? One of the things I learned, at least I want to agree with me, is that everyone's kind of faking it there. Like, and you're working with so many people who are like 23 and they were a gov major and now they're leading like an economics portfolio. It's like kind of scary actually. And you just kind of learn that everyone's showing up and like figuring out what they need to do. And I think that, you know, we went through two different programs, but both science-based coming into this world. And most of the fellows that I know were really effective at just sort of hitting the ground and learning quickly. And I think because coming from the degrees that we all did, you know how to do that deep learning on a short time scale and just get into it and really get into the details and understand it. And it's a little intimidating at first, but you just kind of do that. And then you're an expert in 6 months and you know more than everyone around you, because that's just sort of the pace and the scale. I think like with policy, there's like, people don't often like get to penetrate as deep into like the knowledge and the learning as you do in science. And so I think we've got like sort of a higher bar for that. And it's a little bit transferable in that it like, you can come up to speed and become a subject matter expert. I think you're more practiced in doing that than people from other disciplines in some cases. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually Alex had a question that he had posed about this, which I feel like it leads perfectly into this, and maybe you've answered it a bit already. But just on the topic of needing to delve into these topics that are maybe disparate compared to what you delved into during your master's or PhD. Is that still is that demand still put on you in your current job roles? Like, I understand that during fellowships, obviously it is. And is that still sort of something you deal with day to day, or is it like?
We were just kind of talking about that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, like I found I didn't love the like wear many hats kind of job being on the Hill where you're, especially if you work on the house side where the whole staff might be 10 people and you are covering climate and environment and econ and this and that. It's like inch deep, mile wide on everything. And it's just like, it's impossible to learn it all. And so everyone gets really used to knowing enough to talk about it intelligently and to express like what their boss wants them to do on it. But it's really challenging. I was like fine with that for a year and then was like, but I missed being a subject matter expert. And so I was really looking for a job, which I found where all I do is wildfire, which like in Hill terms is like incredibly narrow. Like no one's just thinking about that level of working for Congress, but that's narrow enough for me that I feel like I'm going back to what it felt like before, being sort of a scientist and having like an area of expertise, but then still get to sort of work a lot with Congress and the federal agencies and do all that policy work, but just on a narrow set of issues, which I really like.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with everything you were saying. Yeah, we're definitely chatting about that, about how you're constantly wearing different hats and putting out different fires in different spaces, and suddenly you have negative 5 minutes to become an expert because you need to brief your senator on it, kind of thing. In my current role now, working at a think tank, I get the experience of jumping on different projects, and that I then need to learn about. So like, I mean, I was coming in and working on a project, we're looking at like genomic data gathering in China. And so like, okay, I'm not an expert on Chinese foreign policy and science and development and genomics, but we got like 6 months to kind of figure it out. And so it's like a project-based kind of experience where there's different products that we're going to put out, different briefings and different reports on topically relevant things, but we have a little bit more of a breathing room to actually do that deep dive and use those skills that we really develop in grad school, which is being able to like go deep and do it really, like ask the pointed questions and figuring out the next layer below it and piece together these kinds of things to paint a cohesive, comprehensive picture. Those kinds of skills, being able to do that with a little bit of time, but project-based, where I might be jumping from slightly different project to slightly different project. I don't think anyone's really asked me much about physics recently, except for some weird thing where like the military really cares about quantum stuff. So it's like, I mean, not talk about that, but it's like the like domain expertise of my background doesn't so much come into play as much as like have the ability to deep dive in projects as they come up.
Yeah, I'm curious about what was the timeline like when you guys were both on the Hill? Like, what was the turnaround time like in comparison?
For tasks.
I mean, yeah, I guess like trying to get up to speed on a topic enough that you can like write a brief or start working on something.
I mean, so fast.
Yeah, like yesterday, like
it's like scheduling tells you like
soft mattering. Like you're copy pasting text that someone else wrote. And that's just the way it kind of works. Yeah, the turnaround, it's putting up fires.
Yeah,
really
okay.
We had a lot of like last minute events, like the senator is going to now give the keynote at this huge thing tonight, and he needs to be able to schmooze, and he doesn't know anything about advanced nuclear. I'm like, well, neither do I. And we need to write a whole memo with talking points that align with his other priorities. And he's not going to be happy if they're not good.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. We had it too, where it's like he's giving a talk on the floor about oil prices. So we need the most up-to-date numbers and events. And he could go on in 5 minutes, he could go on in 48 hours, but like whenever he goes on, he needs to have the most up-to-date numbers. And we're like,
how did so was that like, I know you've talked about working with a small team. Was it similar for you?
Yeah, I also worked in person.
So was it sort of like all hands on deck, or was it like you, the scientist, do that? How was that sort of, did you have like a team behind you when you had this quick turnaround and like sort of seemingly insurmountable task?
I had an all hands on deck team.
Okay.
There were 4 of us. We had a AAAS fellow, me, and then 2 permanent staff. And if something like that came up, there was a lot of sympathy, and we all tried to do it together. But
it varied. I think I was a bit more of a floater in my office, where there were 2 or 3 teams that I interacted with, and so my portfolio was like a little bit from this, a little bit from this, a little bit from that. And so when something came up, depending on what area it is, that would be the team that I would be all hands on deck with. Yeah.
Okay.
I think like one of the hardest things about that was coming from science and feeling like I'm not the expert in
Right.
this topic, so
Right.
how dare I be briefing the senator to
Right.
talk about
What
this
is it?
topic? Right, and we're so used to having kind of a narrow set of expertise, and you speak to that, and if you don't know about it, you go to the person who does, or you do the
Right.
research.
Right.
And so it's kind of a like trial by fire, but it's like a good crash course if you go work for an agency or the congressional route or policy in any capacity, like getting more used to not having to have like the full deep learning, perfect all the way, like the subject matter expert, like being able to jump between stuff and know enough to like get it done. And so that's good training for that. Yeah.
Well, but also piggyback on what you were saying earlier, one of the things that helped me feel a little more comfortable with that was the thought that if I didn't do it, that 23-year-old with Google
Yeah.
was gonna
I
do
was
it.
gonna say.
And so like,
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, not to toot my own horn, but like, I'm coming in with that discipline and that background and that ability to say, we can't say that, we don't have the ability to say that, like, was a little bit better. Like, there were definitely things that were better because I was the one handling it rather than a 23-year-old poli-sci person, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So,
Well, and then other than Google, I mean, like, what resources did you have at hand, or were you just relying on the internet, or did you have sort of like subject matter experts that you could call? Like, how does that work?
I was gonna say, if you have the chance to work on the Hill, there is this thing called the Congressional Research Services. They were my friends. I had them on my phone, I had them on my email, I was constantly reaching out to them because it was like, I don't know everything about the history of this particular bill with like weatherization and the funding appropriations going back 30, like, I don't know this stuff. But they hire domain experts who know these things and could put it in legislative context, and they're technically bipartisan and will answer all of your calls, no matter how trivial it is.
That's great.
Like they would answer. So that was a huge resource that I leveraged.
And they sit in the Library of Congress, and like their whole job is just to take calls from you with questions, and they
amazing.
send you a memo. It's really cool. It's also like a cool place to look to work because there's a lot of people who come from academia who've gone and worked for Congressional Research Services. The other nice thing about the Hill, and hopefully we're not talking too much just about the Hill, but
I don't know. I mean, you guys tell me if you're interested in it, if you're not interested in the house, someone can just try to move on.
the cool thing there is that people really, really want FaceTime with you from outside organizations, even if you're just a fellow who's been working there for 2 months. And so you can draw on a lot of outside expertise, and people are really excited to give that to you. And it creates a great opportunity to meet people all at different organizations and work with them professionally. And then as you start thinking about moving out of the fellowship and what do you want to do next, you kind of got a good lay of the land and contacts at different places. So that's how I ended up in my role at the Nature Conservancy. I've been working with a woman a lot on the bill I was writing, and then just coming to the end of the fellowship and this job came up and I was like, hey, and she's like, that's actually on my team. And then I got the job, and that's not uncommon. So I think that, or working at an agency, like you'll get a lot of opportunity to just sort of meet people and hear about their work. So you like get a better sense of what's out there, but then also you get those contacts and the networking and all that.
Yeah. I think we'll transition more into like career stuff. That is what the panel is about. I got caught up on it. Sorry, guys. But yeah, so okay, you mentioned a little bit about your path into where you are now, but can you talk more about how you went through getting your first job out of academia? And sort of like I mean,
First job out of academia. I don't even know what my first job out of academia is.
right.
My postdoc?
Well,
Is that-
maybe after your postdoc, did you go
The
directly from
fellowship?
yeah.
The fellowship, is that my first job?
Is that, I feel like that counts.
Okay,
I feel like that counts.
okay, sure.
Well, I mean, you'll both have different, I think, things to say about that, because I know, Cam, you worked for the state of
Yeah,
Yeah,
Maine.
well, yeah, why don't you answer?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, well, so
And then you fill it in.
yeah. I guess if you count on leaving undergrad as like leaving academia.
Yeah, I feel like that, I mean, I think it's more like, I
What's the
mean,
path?
right, what was the path? I mean,
Yeah.
for me at least, and I don't know how true this is for everyone here, but I came directly from undergrad. And so the concept of like being out on the market for a job is a little bit foreign to me.
Totally.
And so marketing myself, trying to see what I'm actually a competitive applicant for, tough to say. So it would be valuable.
Yeah, so leaving undergrad, did like climate science bachelor's, but like wasn't ready to go into a PhD. So I was like, I need to do something, but what does this degree qualify me to do? It's kind of tough. So I ended up taking an internship with the state of Maine. I had done a lot of like GIS, coastal modeling kind of research as an undergrad. And so the state was trying to set up their first like sea level rise maps. This was back in like 2014. They had none of those resources, and they had no sense of their climate vulnerability on the coast. And so they were looking for someone with GIS skills. I knew the hiring manager from a class project I'd done. So I worked with him and talked with him a lot about the job and got it. And it was like a 3-month summer internship. I felt like it was sort of, wasn't what I wanted right out of undergrad. I was hoping for just like a real job, and then, but it was grant funded. So then they extended it 6 months and then another 6 months, and I ended up staying there for 2 years for the duration of the project. And so lesson learned for me there was like not to underestimate any opportunity. It was really, it seemed on paper like not what I wanted, but then it ended up kind of setting me up for my whole career.
Yeah.
And then once the money dried up, I transitioned to a state agency in a permanent position fairly easily, because once you're put in the door, it's really easy to move around. So yeah, it's like, I hate to be very like DC about it, but the networking thing and just talking to people, and like when a job comes up and you can email somebody because you
That's
knew
gonna come up
them.
in a second.
Yeah. All right, I'll save it, but that really matters, which is, yeah,
Mhm.
good or bad.
Yeah. I guess my experience was a little bit different,
Yeah.
because the fellowship that I had and the think tank position that I have now were cold contacts for me, I guess.
Interesting.
And so
What was
this
that
was a
like?
little bit different,
Uh-huh.
a little bit scary. So yeah, so through my postdoc, like my PhD advisor and my postdoc advisor knew each other, they knew my work. Before I had put in my application, like he knew who I was, kind of thing.
Mhm.
That's the best, if you can get a job that way. Definitely that makes it the easiest kind of process. But then for the fellowship on the Hill, it was more like I knew academia wasn't the best fit for me, but I didn't know what else was out there. And it was like a lot of it was pouring through my contacts and like, who switched out of academia? And there was one friend from grad school I knew who had done this fellowship. And so I reached out to her to be like, hey, I haven't spoken to you in a couple of years. Like, what's your life like? And just chatted with her a little bit. I chatted with some other folks who had transitioned out to just listen to the words they were saying and figure out what words to put into Google to sort of go next. And then when it came to, then I found out about this fellowship thing, which basically is 1 year. It's really good for like bridging that transition if you're coming in from academia and you want to switch into policy, because it's very reputable, like people know the name. You get like an extra thing in your CV that people are like, oh, I know what that is. So that's great. And then I needed cold contact, where it was like, my friend knew a friend.
Mhm.
And so she gave me their email and I reached out, and a lot of it was like, as hard as this was to do, when I wrote my applications, I had people look it over and be like, oh, no, don't say that. Like, this is meandering nonsense. Or like, this little one-line thing you said is really cool. That's what they're gonna care about. Expand that into 2 more paragraphs. Like having more eyes on the application is gonna make that transition was really good. And then to get the job that I have now at the think tank, like I knew I wanted to stay in a research space. And so again, it was similar to like, think about other people who had gone through my fellowship, what were they doing afterwards? And then it was like, finding reports that I thought were really cool, and then what were the think tanks that generated those reports? And then putting feelers out to get an idea of like, before a position opened up, like I knew when it was gonna be available, so I'd be able to like actually get in my application. A lot of cold contacts.
Yeah.
But I find that people like to talk about themselves.
They do.
So, and then particularly in Washington, where it could be like, can I buy you coffee while you tell me about your life? And a lot of them are like, yes, happy to do that.
Okay.
I'm doing it with someone on Wednesday.
Yeah.
PhD student from
Yeah.
Stanford.
Yeah.
So yeah, reaching out to people, you might get not hear back from 9 out of 10 people if you're reaching out cold on LinkedIn or email or whatever, but that one
Yeah.
you do meet, you know,
Yeah.
can tell you a lot.
I made a depressing Sankey diagram of all my applications. Just so I kind of see it. I think I ended up putting, it was like 48 applications that wound up with 3 job offers.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
I think it's good to hear that though. I think
Yeah.
I think when approaching anything after your current position, it just sort of feels like, is this hopeless? It's not, obviously, but I think it's good to like hear those numbers, because it feels very insurmountable when you're in it. You're like, I'm putting things out, and like, when am I gonna get the opportunity? Just an interview, you know what I mean? So.
I in my, like, the DC office of TNC, most jobs that go up for people like under 35 get like 500 applications.
Yeah, I've seen it. It sucks.
Yeah,
It's really intimidating.
it's annoying, and knowing that is really
How do you even
hard.
deal with that? I mean, do you guys use those AI systems for resumes and
I
stuff?
don't
or like-
know what we do.
It varies substantially.
Okay.
The place that I have
Yes.
does not use it.
Yeah.
Some places do, where it's like, yeah, the first pass is not even being read. I think, I know, I did put in a few applications for consultancy firms where it was, yeah, the first pass is read, it's not read by a person.
Hmm.
The AI.
Yeah.
Software that they're feeding it into is what's processing it, and that will determine whether or not you need a person.
That's really rough.
Well, the biggest thing I think is if you know somebody who can shoot an email to the hiring manager saying, hey,
Right.
this person's really cool, that will beat out all the AI tricks you can Google.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right. I'm gonna pause with my questions because it is now 1 p.m. So I'm gonna open it up to all of you here and online. So if you have burning questions, please speak up. It's informal, it's not weird. Because I don't wanna just be asking all of my questions, because I have a lot of them, but they're not easy stuff, so.
For kind of a pointed question, people who don't have an idea so much of just a general idea of what a think tank is, how would you define it?
That is, oh my, you're putting me on the spot there.
Yeah, you repeat that really quickly. All right, so just wondering what a think tank is, explainer for all of us who literally are in academia and don't know.
Yes, it is a research institution that does deep dives into policy. Generally speaking, so you bring in that sort of research aspect where you're thinking about something for a long period of time and you're writing up like a summary report, but the audience that reads it, it's not like a journal or anything like that. It is like someone on the Hill, like will be reading it. Someone at a federal agency will be reading it. There's a huge emphasis on like action associated with the research. Like you'll do research on a particular topic. Okay, I'll use I guess one of the projects that I'm working. Okay, I got 2 projects that I'm working on now that might emphasize the kind of different kinds of things you'd be working on. One is we're generating a map of science. So we're looking at worldwide research publications and patents and creating a interconnected network. And then we are clustering on this to sort of pick out different research communities and see their growth. And like, so what are different research clusters that are growing? Who is funding them? Are these things being diverted for military purposes? That kind of stuff. So it's kind of like a data infrastructure that's being built specifically because the questions that pop up are like, okay, well, we really care what kind of technology the PRC is funding. And so then that gets morphed into a different kind of project, which is like this genomic survey research thing that we're doing, which is like doing a deep dive into American policy, Chinese policy, like Pacific nation policy, this kind of stuff, contrasting that with scientific developments. We need to work with domain experts to talk about technological advancements that are actually possible, and sort of blending this all together to create a written report. And the people who read the report want the end section to be like, here are things US policymakers that you can do to help in this space. So that kind of thing. The ecosystem varies substantially. Some of it is how it gets funded pretty much dictates the kind of direction you take. So the way we're funded is through a lot of philanthropy, open philanthropy stuff, like small donations from a bunch of different sources that kind of get put into a pot of money. And then we get to direct how we think this would best be spent, like what kinds of projects we think this would be best spent on. There are different kinds of think tanks that are more contract-based, where they'll get a particular contract from a specific person to look at this specific area, and then you'll go off and like write that kind of thing. Some of it work with government contracts. So like the government wants to study this particular thing, and they'll hire a think tank to like do a deep dive into that particular topic with a specific timeline, because they need it in this format to fit into this piece that they're interested in. So there's those. If that is meandering way of hopefully answering kind of your question.
Yeah. At any chance you guys work on the impact of those policies and like where all the gaps are and how can we rework on the policy? So is there any of the section in the organization who works on that as well?
Yes, and that's usually what you end up writing. It's like, here's this policy, here's the brief that we're writing. Here's what you want to do. Here's what's actually happening because of a gap in policy. And quite often the recommendation is fix this gap. It's usually what pops out. I don't know if you want to.
My team does a lot of similar, we're sort of a 30-person like federal lobbyist team our work's really different than the rest of the organization, and it's more similar to sort of what you're talking about. So we've spent the last 2 years working on this wildfire resilience policy roadmap, and it's looking at all of the policies that affect our ability to, build resilience to wildfire and where are the gaps and what's missing. And so we came up with I think it's 88 recommendations for Congress and the administration for specific, change this in the statute to, get us here. And so it's meant to be that roadmap of just all those fixes. And then a lot of the conversation in DC right now is, well, in my space in climate and environment, at least, is there's so much money in the federal government right now from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's more money than anyone ever expected to have. And the agencies literally aren't prepared to spend it because they need people at desks doing grants and agreements and getting that money out the door. And they need people on the ground doing work in forests for wildfire resilience, and they don't have the staff. And so we're playing a huge role right now in helping to kind of shepherd along the implementation of those funds. And it's a kind of a DC-wide, I'm sure you touched that in various ways, the infrastructure bill or something.
Oh, yeah.
It's a DC-wide problem right now that everyone in policy is trying to fix, is that Congress was we gave you billions and billions of dollars. Why aren't you spending it faster? Why aren't we seeing results? And the agencies are frantic. And then those of us on the outside are kind of playing this intermediary role, trying to help them do that. And that's sort of this softer policy. It's less do a bill to fix this problem. It's more how do you spend down billions of dollars in an effective way so that we justify it for further investments.
Well, it's a general timeline, just to follow up on that, one policy being passed, and then we look at how the policy is impacting, and then giving recommendation based on that, what the general ideas timeline or smaller than that.
Okay, so timeline generally.
It depends.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, working on the Hill, we had turnaround times that were a couple of months for certain things.
In terms of
And then-
implementation.
No, well, it was more we need this thing fixed in this bill, and here's this little line, and there's different amendments and things like that. But then it really depends what the project is. It's how big is the scope? How connected are you to the stakeholders in it? How many people? How many agencies or people need to give their approval before this thing can go through? All of that kind of stuff impacts it.
Yeah.
Maybe for the wildfire, the recommendation was how many year data was there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it is really variable. So we look at a lot of policy impact of okay, we have, some policy changes that's allowed us to go in on natural forest system lands and do tens of thousands of acres of treatments to forests to make them less overgrown and more resilient to fire. And then, you can look back in the 5-year timescale, 10-year timescale and say, okay, what was the impact of that change? And did we implement it properly? Did we do enough work? A fire comes through, what happened, that sort of thing. And that's, years to decades. But then there's a lot of policy work that we do that's a federal agency saying there's some weird fluke in the policy that's preventing us from spending the money in the way we need to spend it. And it's a simple fix, and you just have to get Congress's attention to do it. And when we do that, it's a flip of a switch and it's done. And then that policy impact is just kind of there and measurable sort of immediately, so it just sort of depends, I guess, on what you're doing.
Okay.
My question is more related to your lifestyle change, when you moved from Nigeria and it was your own time, how did you change when you're working in the Senate and working on your jobs, you have to go over your own time, look at a 9 to 5, how much shoveling do you have, how do you
Yeah, maybe you guys could walk us through I know that your days are probably so different because you're jumping around on projects and stuff like that, but a sense of work balance or day-to-day activities, kinds of stuff that you touch on.
Can we just talk about that?
Yeah.
Sure. my life now is better than when it was in grad school. But it went through, okay, like grad school wasn't great because I felt like I was always on. Like you could be working anytime. So why are you not working now? Like, so it was always on. I felt I had a little bit more control over my schedule in my postdoc, but I think that was kind of a virtue of being, like I was doing theory work, could work remotely. I wasn't teaching, so there was like managing my own schedule in that sense. And then working on the Hill, which is like, welcome to both, everything's both, it's still, what is it, drinking from a fire hose while on fire? I don't know, it was like madness, you're always on. And then now the position that I have now, like working at the think tank, it is more 9 to 5, but I have the flexibility to pick and choose when I want to do it. It's fully hybrid, so there are days when I can work remotely, days when I can work in person. It is very well managed, and a lot of times the urgency and chaos of your situation can be attributed to like the nature of the job that you're doing, but also just like how competent are the people that you're working with, because if things are being managed properly, you have a sense of when things are due and can sort of plan accordingly. And so now lifestyle is better. I'm earning as much now as I'm earning more now than I would have had I been a faculty member. So there's that level of lifestyle where you aren't worried about rent. So there's better that, it's better benefits. I find I have more flexibility with my hours and that kind of stuff. But this is a little bit different too, where, yeah, touching on things on the Hill, where it was like, we need this thing out the door yesterday, or we have this really important constituent who wants to talk with us now, so we need to like craft everything around it, or this thing that we thought was a done deal actually fell through, so we need to work through the weekend to figure out how to fix it. Like there's that kind of stuff that pops into kind of that lifestyle, where it's like, I felt like I maybe had more, not power, like I had, it's like what I feel like what I'm doing matters, is impactful. I feel like I can breathe and like plan decades in advance of my own personal life, and I'm not living paycheck to paycheck. So there's, yeah.
The dream, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting nights and weekends was like a weird thing out of grad school, and because I took some time off, I got really used to it, and then I went. Because like you said, you're always on, there's always something to be done. I actually had really good work-life balance on the Hill, but that's rare. I like had a good manager who like defended our time a lot, but it's a pretty local place to work in terms of just like employee well-being. It's sort of well known for that. But my current organization is just great. It's a 35-hour work week. We take everything Friday, we have off, just organization-wide, which is pretty amazing. It's kind of what you make it. So there are a lot of people on my team who, I was just saying this, like love to send an email at 9 p.m. to prove they're working, and like that's their choice, but I don't respond or check in. And if you draw those lines, it's easy to, no one's gonna like call you out for it. It's not quite the case on the Hill, where like something pops up at 9 p.m. you gotta respond. But yeah, work-life balance is really great for me right now.
We pause notifications on Slack.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Wow. What a
Love
concept.
that.
Yeah.
Alex?
I'm curious with the sort of DC-wide problem that you mentioned, Cameron, of, agencies not knowing how to spend this money. You said that, you and other NGOs are kind of helping them solve this. So what are the details of how that works? Are you actually talking to people from these agencies pretty often, or is it coming through publications?
So the wildfire work I do, we're primarily working with the Forest Service through USDA, and then Department of Interior. And just as an example, like one of their biggest challenges is workforce capacity. Everyone's talking about workforce capacity right now. To spend $20 billion for wildfire resilience in the next 5 years, you need a certain number of employees on the ground doing the work, and then behind desks doing the necessary work to spend those funds out, and they don't have it, and they can't hire. And I don't know if anyone's ever applied to a federal job, but it's the most miserable experience through this
USA jobs.
USA jobs.
Yeah.
It's like a complete and total nightmare, and they literally just can't put people, you know, in these positions to do the work. So we talked a lot with them about how do we do that, and one avenue they're looking at is it's actually easier sometimes for them to do these big grants and agreements with outside organizations like TNC who have wildland firefighters all throughout the West that work for us directly and are happy to step over from our preserve onto national forest system land and do the work. They can't do that right now because we don't oversee those lands. And so thinking creatively about like, can we leverage that existing workforce through as an external agreement to, you know, instead of people getting people on for the Forest Service directly. So just thinking about things like that. So we're in constant conversation with the agencies. Congress they're so reactive. They send this money out. They don't understand why it's not being spent. They are like, you don't have enough people, hire more. Like, what's the problem? And so we also do a lot of like trying to play that middleman between the two and go to Congress and sort of explain to them, you know, they're going through right now oversight hearings, all the agencies. So the Chief of the Forest Service getting dragged in, getting yelled at by senators for why the money's not getting spent. And so we're testifying in a hearing tomorrow on that, someone from TNC, and to kind of try to support and like explain a little bit more as like a impartial third party. So we do a lot of that. Yeah.
I know some agencies like NOAA work with other companies that basically like have workers. And so it's interesting to hear that like NGOs are now sort of functioning not the same at all, but similarly.
Yeah, that's quite common. Yeah, that agencies will hire from via like consulting, essentially like you apply to, I forget what NOAA uses, but there's a couple of companies. Yeah. Contractor.
Yes, yeah.
And it's ultimately a way to not give you federal benefits, which is not good,
Nice.
but it's a lot easier than getting a job
Yeah,
directly with the agency
right.
through USA Jobs. And so, and it's also a foot in the door, and a lot of people convert into.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in working for an agency, the first question you should always ask is like, who's their contractor? And they'll have a private company, and there's jobs that come up, and there's way more that come up there than on the agency directly.
Yeah.
And it's a great foot in the door. And then it functions a lot more like just like a standard job application rather than USA Jobs, which is just so hard to get through.
Yeah.
Allie.
Catherine, I'm wondering, so you said you were like a physicist turned data scientist, and I'm assuming you did like a lot of coding stuff in your PhD and postdoc, but how has that? Yeah.
I said safe assumption.
Same assumption, yeah. But like, how has your like coding skill set changed, and like what were there new skills you had to take on in this job? And then also if you're on your fellowship, and you had a year off of doing a lot of that type of work, that was it first.
Yeah.
And
Yes, so many things I want to say about that. So I guess the biggest like change from a coding perspective, it's like I'm doing a lot of natural language processing stuff now, which I did not do in my time in academia. A lot of what I was doing before was like running simulations, just old school Fortran, Python, just because archaic stuff with cosmology, but also like a lot of just Python analysis, like all of that. So there was all of that I developed in those contexts with a lot of like modeling, statistical analysis, that kind of stuff. On the Hill, they were very impressed that I made a graph in an Excel spreadsheet. So like, whew. So yes, I paused my coding skills there. My GitHub repo just had like no updates for a long period of time. That was weird. And now, yeah, diving into a lot of cloud computing stuff, because we'll be running language models that like I can't run on my little laptop. And so a lot of cloud computing skills that I hadn't developed before. We do a lot of database stuff. So I was like, I need to dust off some SQL code because I have not done this in 10 years. But it was pretty good getting up to speed with that, and really just a lot of Python stuff. Because yeah, a lot of what we'll deal with is text data in many different languages. And so it's like, how do you process it to get at the information you're actually interested in? It is kind of the coding side that creeped in. And I didn't think I'd miss it, but I missed programming. And I miss being able to hone those really technical skills, and the position that I have now, like, really allows me to do that.
TV is very different from resume, and academic circle, we are more used to write cover letters and CV, and we know that our publication is going to matter, and some connection from the professor and things like that, but how do we navigate it and use our skill and put it in our resume and say that we can do that? And because it's a very different world altogether, it's sometimes I feel nervous in saying those things aloud. Like even though I'm doing that, we very much think in that handy circle. So how did you guys do that?
I had friends look over it and tell me what to do, because I also had no idea. And yet converting a CV to a resume, especially getting it down to a one pager, because the person who's reading it will spend all of 10 seconds on it. So you need to have that kind of jump out. It was a lot of iterations, a lot of reaching out to people being like, hey, can you send me your CV and resume? And then can you look over mine, and like actually listening to the comments and suggestions that they had to say. I don't know if you had.
Yeah, I
better.
did the same thing. There's a lot of just like Googling and reading stuff online too about like what's the difference, what should it look like. The big exception again is if you're applying to a federal job, it has its own format for a resume, which can be like up to 10 pages long, but it's not a CV, it's the
It's very
different.
confusing.
And it takes about a year to put it together because it's just so specific how they want it. So beware of that. But yeah.
The more you do, the like less daunting it becomes. So just start doing it, I guess, would be the biggest recommendation.
I think a hard part is oftentimes like our networks are so specific to academia that like thinking of someone to ask, I think like it's hard sometimes to pull out a name, you know? So there's that. I wonder, yeah, I mean, friends obviously who like work in other sectors. I guess useful. Do you have any other like thoughts on like resources?
I was surprised when I started reaching out how friendly and willing to help most people were. And so even though it was like people I hadn't spoken to for a couple of years, reaching out, I got very enthusiastic, positive responses, and they were willing to read over my stuff and send me their application material and all of that kind of stuff. So it's like, I wouldn't assume that it could be a contact you haven't actually touched base with in a while, but like, that doesn't mean they're out. Like you can still reach out to them. And then my thought process is I pay it forward. So like, I do the same when people reach out to me now.
Well, you're here now, right?
Yeah.
So-
I'll read all the resumes.
I would look at like, I know personally pretty well two AAAS fellows from the last couple of years who did their PhDs at Columbia. And if you're thinking about making a jump to policy, I would look at like recent AAAS fellows. It's just like such a known program in DC. Even if you don't know them, reach out, tell them who you are, and just say, I'm thinking about fellowship, but also policy more in general. Can you hop on the phone and would you take a look at my resume? I'm sure I'll get back to you.
Question about like personal fulfillment about the impact you make. This, you know, they both have pros and cons, and what you're feeling of differences between them.
Can
you repeat it?
Yeah, so I guess personal fulfillment in the work, being in academia versus leaving for science policy or leaving academia in general, what your personal experience has been with that.
Yeah, I kind of got into policy, I mentioned, because of the work I did in state government where I was doing scientific research, but then kind of like delivering it to its end user, you know, to these vulnerable communities who like didn't know what their climate future looked like. And so I was like in the field or behind a computer 99% of the time, but then I was like presenting at a town meeting and like seeing people and like asking questions, and I loved seeing that impact. That I've been like stepping more and more into that direction ever since, to the point where I've now kind of moved away from the science and just towards that sort of like delivery of science-based policy. So in that sense, I guess I'm happy where I am and get to see a lot of the like direct connections to the work I'm doing, and then seeing an output that's changing something in people's lives or, you know, natural environments in a way that's very fulfilling.
The fulfillment was the piece that I missed in academia. It just by virtue of the things that I really love doing, that I'm passionate about, policy wound up being a much better fit for that. Because yeah, I could see the impact that I was doing more directly. it felt less like I was working in a esoteric bubble that 3 other people cared about, like. Actually, people are directly caring about what I have to say, like right now, as opposed to like, I mean, the stuff I was working on, like, okay, maybe people won't care about this for 20 years if ever, kind of thing. And it just, it depends what you find fulfilling. Sometimes working on a very cryptic technical problem that you can do the deepest of dives into, like that could be what you find fulfilling. And in that sense, maybe academia is a much better fit for that. For me, I wanted more of like, I wanted the people side of it, like who are the people being impacted by this work, and how does society impact this, and like where do I fit in the broader community? And because I wanted that policy, like science policy, ended up being a sort of slightly better fit. That was a piece that I think I was missing, me personally. But it's like, what do you find personally fulfilling, and then like the different sections will have different parts of that to offer.
In terms of like having a specific area that you wanted to focus on going into the policy, like how well did you, first of all, but also like how useful do you think that is? Like, because I know a lot of times, especially in academia, it's like, you know, you should kind of know what you want to study. But you guys have also mentioned that there's a lot, or I mean, varying amounts of, you know, go become an expert on the team on this subject, you know, so I mean, is it helpful, or would you say it's even harmful to say like, yeah, I'm like coming in, I know I want to get, you know, nuclear policy or something like that.
I would decide like less like what specifically do you want to work on, and more, do you want to work on something sort of narrow like that, or do you want to be a generalist and try out a bunch of stuff for a little while? Like we were both generalists on the hill, and like whatever's needed, you just do, you know, and I didn't really like that. And I've learned that about myself, you know, and then I went out and was like, I want to be specific. All my background was in coastal adaptation science, but now I'm just doing wildfire. I was like less worried about exactly what I was doing, and more like I just wanted it to be kind of specific, and that's how I sort of guided my work a little bit. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I was gonna say fake it till you make it, but then actually no, you had a much more nuanced and clear perspective on it. Very good. But yeah, figuring out what you want and what actually works for you probably is more important than figure out what you think the system will game you with, and try to sort of adjust accordingly. I was a generalist. I didn't know what I wanted exactly. This was a little awkward for some of the interviews where it was like, I mean, one of them asked me, okay, in 12 months, what are the like specific things that the specific metrics you will have for success? Like what areas will you have worked on that you will judge yourself based on how successful? It's like, I don't know. I did not get a call back from that one.
Yeah.
But then I had other interviews where it's like, what I'm looking for is more of an experience rather than a topic. And so being able to like explain and articulate my actual things that drive me was more valuable than trying to say, oh, I want to work on this specific area and a specific thing, because I wasn't working in that context. It is a little awkward if you come in and say, I'll work on anything, I don't know. Because a lot of times they want you to have done a lot of the mental load, because everyone's strapped for time. They're working on 20 different things. As much as the mental processing you can do ahead of time can be beneficial. So if you have some like general ideas of areas, learn enough jargony words to sort of bullshit your way through the interview, and you'll be okay with that understanding of you getting in touch with your own self to figure out what it is you actually want out of that. I think would be pretty valuable.
And I feel like with specific jobs, there's going to be a specific range of issues to work on, not on the hill. Like the fellowships that we both did, and pretty much any science policy fellowship where you're moving from like sort of academia more into policy is always seen as like a stepping stone, like a pivot. And I say across the board, and this was so true for mine, they want to like understand why you must have this fellowship in order to pursue a career in science policy. And so that's just talking about what are the skills you don't have and that you think you'll get through this experience, such that you can go do X, Y, Z. And so that doesn't have to be specific topics so much as like specific outcomes, I think, to your point, which is really helpful to make a more compelling case for your application.
It sounds like you don't really have to like know a ton about like how the process works, like legislative processes or the structure of the government,
No.
which
No.
is helpful, because I mean, I know I don't think that's like anything that, well, maybe not anything, but I think a lot of us don't touch on that at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the worst thing you can do is like get in your own way with imposter syndrome about
Yeah.
any kind of pivot like that, especially in policy reference, making it like group lesson
Yeah.
multiple times.
Yeah.
I think you can all learn it. It's a lot easier to learn, come up to speed quickly in policy than it is to come up to speed quickly in the science underlying the policy, and you all have the scientific chops. So just fake it, and then you'll be functional after 6 months, and it's all good.
I think so also, I mean, I'm not an American citizen, I'm a Canadian who came into this fellowship, and it was like, I know the government exists. And but part of the AAAS program, and we had like a 2-week orientation, like classes where they were like, here are the 3 branches of government.
Yeah.
Here is how a bill becomes law, like, these are the chambers and the, like, very basic stuff to kind of help you get to speed with that. And then hopefully the people that you're working with, you pick up on the jargon enough to figure out like their specific aspect of the government that they're looking at. Like, here are the things that you need to learn and care about in that sense. Yeah.
all right, well, I think that, or do you have one more question? Yeah, go ahead.
One more question
Yeah, well, this will be the
about
last one.
publication.
Mm.
So how important is the publication for these jobs? And do you like continue to write, or you just stop there, or your job requires you to write papers?
So, just for anyone who's online, how important is being published, and do you have to continue publishing to work in this field?
Okay, publications came into play during my application for the fellowship because they wanted to know like how accomplished of a scientist you are. And so being able to sell my publications was valuable. In my current position, like, we publish briefings and reports, so they aren't peer-reviewed journal things. And for stuff like that, being able to say like, I wrote an op-ed will be more valuable than I have 10 publications in journals. Like, so it sort of depends what. My job specifically does not have publication requirements, so like I could publish never, or I could publish every month, and it really depends like how much I would have put into it, but it's not a part of my evaluation right now. And yeah, it's a lot more like briefings or news articles or stuff like that they kind of care about now. Yeah.
Yeah, I've
That's
never
good to
had someone ask about publications in an interview. So.
I think that op-eds was a really good point though, because that's something we can all do right now. I mean, obviously, it's a big ask in terms of our workload, but that's something that you don't need to go through a journal and pay money to do any of this. A lot of times there are places, even here at Columbia, that will take your writing. Or if you're a part of like a different scientific society, like I'm part of AGU, and for geologists and geosciences, they have like a little sub place where like you can be a writer and they have an editor and it costs nothing and it's totally on your terms, but it's something that you can sort of like have aside from your technical background that shows that you can communicate science effectively and that it lives somewhere online as well. So that's a thought.
That is really helpful. Like, I interviewed AAAS for our new fellow when I was on the Hill, and there were the people that we were really interested in had like the smallest little nods towards policy or interest outside of their direct research, like volunteering for a few months for their like League of Conservation Voters chapter, or like doing op-eds and things like that.
Yeah.
And there's like tiny little things set them apart to just demonstrate that interest a little more than just them saying I'm interested, you know, they sort of proved it. It goes a long way. Yeah.
You can even say you're part of the seminar series. So. Okay, with that, I think we will wrap up. So big thank you to Katherine and Cam for being with us today.
Do we do something
Did
for the
we-
online people?
Is there anything on the line?
Well, I asked, no one.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Cool.
Very good.
Thank you
Thanks
all
for
being
organizing
here.
and moderating.
Oh.
A lot of fun.